Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The first time I visited Israel in 1991, when you had to take a separate paper visa because you didn't want your passport stamped with Israeli visas, I was struck, one, by the openness of the Israeli society, but second, also how prepared it was for a war. Because this was January 1991, the first Gulf War was on and scuds were raining on Israel. So in fact, I, along with Prashant Panjiyar, the India Today photographer, we were both there when the scuds were falling, carrying our masks, and for the first day or so hiding in the basement, after that not really caring that much. We had no real contacts in Israel at that time. And also, India and Israel did not have full diplomatic relations. So we had also gone there through a roundabout route, which means going to Amman, then taking a permit from the Jordanian Ministry of Interior to visit Jerusalem, then crossing the land border at Allenby Bridge. On this side, showing your Jordanian Interior Ministry permit. On the other side, Israeli side, showing your paper visa issued by the Israeli consulate in Mumbai at that time. Now, how did we manage as we got into Israel? Because we didn't know anybody. Then we were told that the woman, wonderful woman who headed the foreign press section, like the equivalent of our JSXP, external publicity. Her name was Linda Rivkin, and she was from a Jewish family in Kolkata. And just the reporter's luck, she was also the sister-in-law of Associated Press bureau chief in Delhi, Arthur Max. So he was Arthur's wife, Ruth's sister, and they had told us about her. So we reached out to her and she said, listen, you are Indians. We've never seen Indian journalists in Israel before. You need help. So come, I will give you your gas mask and your injections, etc. and training in case there is a nerve gas attack. But you also need some contacts. So then I asked her, so what do I do with contacts? She said, don't worry. You need to know only one person. There is only other fellow Indian who's now present in Israel who matters. And that is Zubin Mehta. So she introduced us to Zubin Mehta, who has followed the tradition of coming into Israel as a friend every time Israel is facing a war-like situation. So we went to see Zubin Mehta in what was labeled the Zubin Mehta suite at the Tel Aviv Hilton. And he said, look, don't worry, I will open all the doors for you, which he did, which is a long story that I will tell you some other time. But among the things he did for us was, he gave us a t-shirt each. I think he had a pile of them lying there. And that t-shirt had a map of the Middle East, a tiny sliver called Israel, and then on the other side, a big Israel, bigger than all of the Middle East, saying the largest small country in the world. Why do I tell you this story? Because many things have happened over the last 48 hours in the Middle East and also in Europe. In fact, in the Balkans, with two rather obscure countries from where we sit in India. But all of them are somehow centered into this tiny country called Israel, or sort of justifying Israel's claim of being the center of the world. No, it's not the Middle Kingdom, they never say so. Also, on how important this little country is. So the largest, if not the largest, among the most important little countries in the world. So we know the big thing that's happened, that's been in our headlines also, which is that Israel and Bahrain have now decided to, it's not a peace deal because these two countries were not at war, but it is a reconciliation because the countries did not recognize each other, particularly Bahrain did not recognize Israel. Now that's happened within a month of UAE and Israel normalizing their relations, on which we had also given you a cut the clutter. I am again sharing that link with you today so that you can see some continuity. Now Bahrain doing this is especially important. Why? Because Bahrain, for all practical purposes, is an outpost of Saudi Arabia. It's a protectorate, a client state. I would not call a sovereign country a vassal, but it's always been completely dependent on Saudi Arabia. In fact, the first time we went to Saudi Arabia during the same Gulf War was through Bahrain. So we landed in Bahrain and then we drove across the causeway into Dhahran, where the Allied forces were headquarters. Lately, for about a decade now, Bahrain's dependence on Saudi Arabia has become even stronger. Why? Because a lot of what happens in the Middle East ultimately becomes Shia Sunni and Arab Iran. So Bahrain is another of those countries where the majority population is Shia, but the ruling elites are Sunni. What is the result then? The result is that there is a fear of democracy, because the moment it becomes one citizen, one vote, then Sunni elites can't rule. The ruling family does not want that to change. So about a decade back, when Arab Spring started, there was a big fear in Bahrain that this was spreading there also. Now Bahrain obviously decided to come down very hard on Arab Spring. They executed people, they jailed them, they tortured them, all kinds of things happened. But they were only able to do it because of Saudi backing. Saudi forces, also Saudi backing ideologically. Since then, Bahrain is become even more politically dependent on Saudi Arabia. It was always economically dependent on Saudi Arabia. It now became politically and militarily dependent on Saudi Arabia. So that's the situation. That's why when Bahrain now goes and makes up with Israel, then the question comes up, if Bahrain has come in, can Saudi Arabia be far behind? Why? Because Bahrain would never do such a thing without clearance from the big bosses in Riyadh. And that has obviously happened. Now, this is something with wide-ranging political significance. Because first of all, from whatever I am reading globally, and from whatever little knowledge I have of the Middle East, you know that some of you say that I get really excited when I talk about the Middle East. Saudi Arabia will not be in such a hurry to formally establish diplomatic relations with Israel for a couple of reasons. One, there is this competition in the Islamic world with Iran on the one side, on the Shia-Sunni basis, but also Turkey on the other. Turkey is another powerful nation, Islamic nation, but a Sunni nation. Second, Saudi Arabia still has the king who is in his mid-80s. And for someone of his generation, for an Arab Muslim of his generation to accept Israel in his lifetime is very, very rough. In fact, if I may refresh your memory, and you can see some references. I'm sharing an article by Landler of the New York Times with you. He's the London bureau chief of the New York Times, and a lot of rich detail is available in that article. But Mohammed bin Salman, on a visit to, he's the crown prince, the all-powerful leader of Saudi Arabia, when he said in Washington some time back that the Israelis have a right to their land and Palestinians also have a right to their land. That was said almost like an afterthought. Immediately, the Saudi official news agency put out some statements that look like clarifications, saying that the king and the Saudi government stands by the two-nation commitment, that there should be a two-nation solution. So if you are just counting, then Bahrain becomes the fourth Arab nation now to recognize Israel. Which are these four in sequence, sequence of history? Egypt 1979, Jordan 1994, UAE just a few weeks back, and now Bahrain. So this is moving very fast. And Donald Trump is claiming all these as his successes. This is directed both at the American right wing as well as the Jewish vote in America. And the person who's leading this on Trump's behalf is his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. He's also struggled for a long time, desperately trying to get some success in the Middle East, and looks like he can claim some success now. So if you read Landler's article, which you should, he quotes Martin Indyk, who's a redoubtable American diplomat, who I know courtesy our common friend Tom Friedman. Martin Indyk was America's ambassador to Israel. He was also Obama's peace envoy to the Middle East. wonderful man. So Martin Indyk is quoted there as saying most that this deal is not so much a peace deal. He says it's more a strategic deal than a peace-related decision. Why does he say so? He says so because right now Bahrain, UAE, Oman, Sudan, they are not at war with Israel. But all of them have some kind of a threat or some kind of a fear of Iran. So this is a new strategic repositioning by the Arab Sunni Middle East, which is away from Iran. So in terms of strategic threats, Iran is a much bigger strategic threat in their point of view than Israel. And that's where strategy takes precedence over ideology. So remember, in life, when nations, human beings also make big decisions in life, self-interest drives them. And that's where, for nations, strategy comes above, ranks above ideology. So that is what is happening. In fact, it is now, you see, if you see all the straws in the wind, it's quite possible that the next country to normalize will be Morocco. In fact, as we speak, Morocco and Israel have decided now to restore civil aviation links between themselves. There is also an ethnic connection between Israel and Morocco. Lots of Moroccan Jews have come into Israel. And next, then you look at Oman. Oman, the Sultan of Oman had hosted Netanyahu in 2018. Don't forget that. Oman, Sudan. So those are the countries which it looks like will follow now. Whether it happens before the US elections or after, I don't know. Some may happen before US elections also. Saudi Arabia obviously will wait for many things. But if you look at the reality, much has normalized between Saudi Arabia and Israel also. Now they allow each other's civil aviation to overfly each other. In fact, it started with Saudi Arabia allowing Air India's Tel Aviv flight to overfly their country, which normally would not have been allowed. When I first flew to those parts, direct, El Al, I think, from Bombay to Tel Aviv, that plane had to go a long way around the Horn of Africa or someplace and somehow reach Ben Gurion Airport. No longer. So Saudis and Israelis have already doing a lot of stuff together. What is de facto will become de jure in the course of time. But before that, you might see all the remaining other Arab Sunni states following the example of UAE and now Bahrain. The other line I read in this discussion is again Landler's article. It says, what has happened is a result of serendipity as much as spade work. Now you can say serendipity because the movement has been in this direction since 1991, since the first Gulf War, when a lot of these Arab countries saw the danger from Saddam Hussein because he had gone and occupied Kuwait. Now Saddam Hussein was an Arab leader, so they saw the danger from Saddam Hussein and more left of center or allegedly left of center Baathism. So that made them look at Israel differently because they saw Saddam Hussein along with Israel as a common enemy. So serendipitously you can say that what's happened today is a logical conclusion of the process that started then. Now some countries are holding out. You might say that Qatar is holding out because, as we said before to you, Qatar and Turkey today are like the two strong Muslim Brotherhood countries. Will they do it? I don't know. But it does seem like Qatar had collaborated quite openly with the Israelis earlier to intervene with Hamas to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza. So it's not as if those two sides are not on talking terms. And don't forget that Americans are present in great strength both in Bahrain and Qatar. So it's a funny situation where Qatar might have other ideological views than America, but the Americans are present there. Bahrain so far had boycotted Israel, but now has normal relations. Americans are present there. Turkey is now turning anti-Israel and also anti-America, but America, the NATO ally, Americans have a base there. is also fighting with Greece, which is also a NATO, EU member, and the Americans are now supporting Greece. In fact, US Secretary of State Pompeo has just this Saturday issued a statement in support of Greece and saying that Turkey is bullying Greece. In this mess up, you see these few things falling in place, which is very, very, very important. Now, how did this start? This started very interestingly with an article that Yusuf Al Otaiba, who was the UAE ambassador to Washington, he wrote on the front page of an Israeli newspaper, Israeli Hebrew newspaper, Yediot Aharonot, in which he said that Israelis have to understand they can either have annexation of West Bank territories or recognition or normalization. They can't have both. They can't have annexation and normalization. That is when Jared Kushner, maybe it was done like a 1-2 punch, but that is when Jared Kushner then picked up the thread from there and started working with Netanyahu and other forces. And this is the promise that the Arab countries are now getting from Netanyahu, that there will not be annexation of West Bank territories. And now that there is more clarity on Israel agreeing to not annex West Bank territories, there is expectations that as this go ahead, at some stage, Palestinians will also have the incentive to resume negotiations with Israel, because these Arab countries are crucial in terms of their support to the Palestinians. Palestinians are Arabs. Iran and Turkey, etc., can't sustain them. So it's a matter of time before you might see some other settlements also. In fact, if you see other Islamic countries, say Pakistan for example, there is quite a strong debate within Pakistan on what should Pakistan do now. Should they continue with their hostile policy towards Israel, or should they also make some changes? Once again, Pakistan will have to choose between the two Islamic universes, that is the Turkish universe, Erdogan's universe, and the Arab universe, that is the Saudi universe. Now, having said that, I said that Israel has become the center of things happening not just in the Middle East but also in distant Balkans. Now, why should we even be bothered about two little countries in the Balkans called Kosovo and Serbia? Serbia has a population of 7 million, 70 lakh people, about a third of Delhi. Kosovo has a population of just 2 million, 20 lakh, about 1/10 of Delhi. Now, they've had an agreement in Washington, negotiated there, will be now signed up as this week begins. What are these two countries saying? Now, I'm not going into a lot of the history of Kosovo and Serbia, because then that will take me into the history of the end of Cold War and the unraveling of Yugoslavia, and then I'll have to go into Montenegro and Macedonia and Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia, Herzegovina and Kosovo. That is not the intention, maybe some other time. But these two countries, Kosovo broke away from Serbia. Serbia has considered Kosovo as a part of its country, and the dispute has gone on. Now, these two countries are now signing a peace deal, again brokered by Donald Trump, whereby they pretty much accept each other as separate countries. Now, Serbia will not say that Kosovo is a separate country and we accept it, but they've said that for the next year, they will not oppose Kosovo's membership of any international body. Kosovo has said, on the other hand, that for 1 year, they will not make any further applications to international bodies. So that is a step forward, but a lot of the other normalization tells you that these two countries are normalizing their relations, which is good in the Balkans. Now, there are two implications to this as I read up. One is a very obvious implication, and that's why we bring this in the context of Israel right now. And that implication is that Kosovo, which is a 95-96% Muslim country, although it has a clearly secular constitution, completely secular constitution, the state has no religion, it has the largest number of atheists, I think, in that part of the world, but it is nearly 96% Muslim, essentially of Albanian origin. Yet, Kosovo, in this agreement, has recognized Israel and has also decided that it's going to base its embassy in Jerusalem. So Kosovo will now become the first Muslim majority country in the world to base its embassy in Jerusalem. And Serbia again, Serbia is in 95% Christian country. Serbia has decided that they will also move their embassy in Israel now from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So this is a very interesting situation where a country with 70 lakh people makes some sort of a peace with a country of 20 lakh people, which in fact it considers a part of its own country. In the process, both reassert their recognition of Israel. One Christian majority country moves its embassy to Jerusalem, so it becomes the first European country to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Remember, Donald Trump had done that earlier, but that's America. And even more significantly, Kosovo, which is 96% Muslim, recognizes Israel and also decides to set up its assembly in Jerusalem. That's why we were not exaggerating when we said Israel is the smallest big country in the world, because these two little countries in the Balkans making peace have a significant mention of Israel in their peace deal. Now, how is it significant to America? That's a different analysis, but I will tell you from what I'm reading that, and I think that's where Donald Trump and his foreign policy are not all foolish. People tend to treat him as foolish. Nobody is completely foolish. People do foolish things, people do smart things. So he and his people have figured that the front yard of Russia, that the front line to Russia is no longer running through the middle of Germany. That used to be the case in the Cold War. It has now moved eastwards, and Balkans is a very important area because that is the area that both the Russians and the Chinese are now trying to influence. So these are the big things in small countries in the world which I thought are significant and we should know more about. Once again, an aside, also we tell you how conservative some countries still are. As part of their peace agreement, Serbia and Kosovo, which are very conservative socially, have also decided that they will start supporting the global movement for legalization of homosexuality. Interesting little aside. Having said that, I can't conclude today before acknowledging two brilliant, wonderful human beings and Indian public figures who passed away over this weekend. One is Swami Agnivesh, one is Babu Raghuvansh Prasad. Now, Babu Raghuvansh Prasad is not somebody I knew very well personally, but he was the Rural Development Minister under the UPA who moved the Manrega Act and made a wonderful speech. We'll try and find you a copy of that speech and share with you. He was typical of those early socialists who are described as dharti se jude hue, people with their ear to the ground. And frankly, he is the force, he is the uncle who kept Lalu Yadav's RJD together all this while. So while one set of Yadavs had the power, this Yadav actually he was the glue who kept a lot of it going. And he was a brilliant minister, very good rural development minister. I had my own differences or disagreements with Manrega, but it's because of the way he implemented it that some of that skepticism was answered. So he is a bad loss. And remember, even before he went away, he had made a socialist point. He had written to Lalu Yadav and he said that, look, there is nothing socialist about this party anymore. That is RJD, ye Samantwadi hai. This is now a feudal party. All there is to this party is feudalism. So he will be missed. Please read up more about him. And I think my colleague Shankar Arnimesh will tell you more about him today. And DK Singh, our political editor, in the course of this week will tell you about the history of India's original political socialists. And finally, Swami Agnivesh. Now, Swami Agnivesh is somebody I have known very well. I have also recorded more than one Walk the Talk episodes with him. So, in fact, I'll be sharing a link with you. Please see that. I had many disagreements with him on his economics, on his view of rural India, on his view of larger politics. There were many aspects to his politics which I might have seen as hypocritical. But good important thing is, I said and I wrote whatever I felt about his politics and his public positions, and he never stopped talking with me. That is the quality of people, politicians of that generation. They were very forgiving and very open-minded, to the extent of keeping the doors of their houses open. Raghuvansh was like that also. Now, Swamiji, people know him as a very serious person, an agitator, a campaigner, activist, sometimes angry, saffron-clad, but people don't know the funny side to him, that he had a very corny, funny side to him. And I will just quote you this story in tribute to him, because you will read a lot about him, about his work with Bandhua Mazdoors, about his work with farmers, etc., anti-corruption movement. I must tell you, he was the first to figure out something that Prashant Bhushan is saying now, that movement, Anna movement, was not about corruption. It was about politics. He had figured it. Nevertheless, I first saw him in action in 1980 during the Lok Sabha election campaign. Then he was education minister in Haryana in Bhajan Lal's government, which later became Congress government. Then it was Janata Party government. Now these were days when election rallies would go late into the night, and key speakers will run very late. There was no code of conduct limiting the time to which you could campaign. So you needed a crowd warmer to keep people busy while the big speaker came. So this was a night in Kurukshetra during the Lok Sabha elections when Vajpayee was delayed because he was campaigning for Janata Party. So while he was delayed, a large crowd was waiting to listen to him. The responsibility of keeping the crowd involved and warm on a cold night fell on the shoulders of Swami Agnivesh, a much younger Swami Agnivesh. And among the many stories he told the crowd, which may or may not have had any reference to context, one was this. This was a story of a Sethji, who he says claimed to be a big mard and a he-man. And one night, robbers came into his house. And Sethani told Sethji, Sethji, लगता है कि डाकू आ गए हैं, कुछ करिए. तो Sethji said, चुप रहो, बैठ जाओ. Then Sethani got impatient after a while. I'm giving the shorter version of the story because I don't have to keep a crowd warm. She said, आप तो कहते हो मैं मर्द हूँ, मैं मर्द हूँ, मैं मर्द हूँ. I am a he-man, I am a he-man, I am a he-man. Why aren't you fighting these people? So Sethji said, मैं मर्द हूँ, मैं मर्द हूँ, मैं मर्द हूँ, लेकिन मैं तुम्हारा मर्द हूँ, मैं डाकुओं का मर्द नहीं हूँ. I am a he-man for you, I am not a he-man for these dacoits. Now this is a story that I have used sometimes in my writings with reference to him, for when I see a political leader or a government boasting and is not able to deliver on its boasts. So once again, au revoir, Swamiji and Raghuvanshi. It's very difficult to find politicians in the new generation of your quality, your patience and your large